Weaver next tried introducing various electric and magnetic fields into his completely shielded room. Only one had any effect on the amorphous cycles. An infinitesimal electric field, 0.025 volts per centimeter, pulling at 10 hertz dramatically restored normal patterns to most of the biological measurements. Weaver concluded that this frequency in the micropulsations of the Earth's magnetic field was the prime timer of biocycles. The results have since been confirmed in guinea pigs and mice. In light of his work, the fact that 10 hertz is also the dominant alpha frequency of the EEG in all animals becomes a significant bit of evidence that every creature is hooked up to the Earth electromagnetically through its DC system. Recently, a group under Indian biophysicist Sarada Subramaniam reported that human EEG not only responded to the micropulsations, but responded differently depending on which way the subject's head was facing in relation to the Earth's field. Oddly enough, however, the head direction had no effect if subject was a yogi. The relationship had been conclusively proven by recent studies of the pineal gland. This tiny organ in the center of the cranium has turned out to be more than vaguely defined third eye of the mystics. It produces melatonin and serotonin, two neural hormones that, among many other functions, directly control all of the biocycles. The lamprey, akin to the ancestor of all vertebrates as well as certain lizards, has an actual third eye. Close to the head's surface and directly responsive to light, instead of the blind pineal found in other vertebrates. The eminent British anatomist J.Z. Young has recently shown that this organ controls the daily rhythm of skin color changes that these animals undergo. For our story, the most important point is that very small magnetic fields influence the pineal gland. Several research groups have shown that applying a magnetic field of half a Gauss or less oriented so as to add to or subtract from the Earth's normal field will increase or decrease production of pineal, melatonin, and serotonin. Other groups have observed physical changes in the gland cells in response to such fields. The experiments were controlled for illumination. Since it has been known for several years that shining a light on the head somehow modifies the gland's hormone output, even though it's buried so deeply within the head in most vertebrates that, as far as we know, it can't react directly to the light. We likely have to discover many other ways that energy cycles in the solar system affect life on Earth. They may strongly affect the outbreak of disease, for example. The last 6 peaks of the 11-year sunspot cycle have coincided with major flu epidemics. A Soviet group under U.N. Achkasova at the Crimean Medical Institute, working with astronomer B.M. Vladimirsky of the Crimean Observatory, has found a connection between the sun's magnetic field and the Escherichia coli bacteria that live in our intestines and help us digest food. The Russians found the bacteria grew faster when the sun's field was positive or pointing towards Earth, and slowed down when it was negative. 2 days after the passage of each sector boundary, there was a dip in bacterial growth corresponding to the maximum geomagnetic turbulence. The data also showed a decline in growth in response to solar flares. Other Russian scientists have drawn a tentative correlation between the sector cycle and reports from 2 groups of persons with neurological diseases. The patients felt worse within sectors of positive polarity when bacteria seemed to grow faster. Life's magnetic coupling to heaven and earth is apparently more like a web than a simple cord and socket. The attractions of home. An animal's biocycles must be appropriate for its environment if it's to survive. So they must be precisely tuned to its geographic location. We might suspect, therefore, that many creatures would use magnetic information for their sense of place. A great deal of recent work has shown that they do. A built-in compass helps guide them in foraging or other local businesses, as well as migration over much longer routes. The latter fears often rival those of any modern navigator. Monarch butterflies travel from Hudson Bay to South America straight across the Caribbean without ever getting lost. The Arctic tern breeds in summer on the northern ice cap, then moves to Antarctica for the other hemisphere's summer, flying 11,000 miles each way. Some salamanders, only inches long and built very low to the ground, travel up to 30 miles of rugged mountain country in California to set up housekeeping, then return to their home stream to breed. Such activities are hard to experiment with, however, so we've learned more about day-to-day travel. Carl von Furst was the first to attack the problem with his famous 1940 studies of the honeybee dance, which won him a Nobel Prize in 1973. He established that on clear days, bees navigated by combining the sun's angle with their sense of time, the way Boy Scouts are taught to use wristwatches as compasses. The bees also had a polarized light system that could determine the sun's direction through light clouds or forest canopy. Even more amazing, Frisch found that scouts told workers back at the hive where the flowers were by means of a dance using the sun's angle and the direction to Earth's center, the gravity vector, as references. However, Frisch noted that bees could still navigate between food and home just as well on completely overcast days when the sun's angle and polarized light weren't available. There had to be a backup system. It soon turned out that the homing pigeons had the same abilities. In 1953, G. Kramer inferred that the birds must have a compass in addition to a map of remembered landmarks from the way they immediately pointed their beaks toward home after circling once after released. Soon others found the same kind of sun compass as bees used, but the pigeons could also steer perfectly on cloudy days. Back in 1947, H.L. Yeagley had the temerity to suggest in the Journal of Applied Physics that pigeons might have a magnetic sense that allowed them to use the Earth's field, just as we use magnetic compasses. He was ridiculed and refuted by a few inadequate experiments, such as placing a pigeon in a variety of electromagnetic fields and noting it seemed to be comfortable. Others, including Yeagley, attached small magnets to the birds' heads or wings, but found no clear-cut changes in their flight patterns. Only a few researchers quietly looked into the matter further. Dr. Hans Fromm of the Frankfurt Zoological Institute noted in the late 1950s that caged European robins faced longingly in their normal southern west migratory direction, even when they were kept from seeing sun and stars, their usual signpost. His co-workers Friedrich Merkel discovered that, insulated from the Earth's field by a steel cage, they no longer faced in one particular direction. Furthermore, by changing the orientation of the surrounding field with coils, he could give the birds a false sense of where southwest was. The experiment was validated with indigo bunting several years later. There, the matter rested until 1971 when the William T. Keaton of Cornell realized that the pigeon's magnetic sense, if it existed, would be overshadowed by its sun compass, so naturally magnets affixed to the birds would have no effect on clear days. He soon found that the same birds released on a cloudy day got lost. To study this magnetic interference in any weather, Keaton made translucent contact lenses for his birds, then released them in the mountains of northern New York. Simulating dense clouds, The contacts blocked the sun's angle and polarized light, and with one Gauss magnets attached to their heads, the birds couldn't find their way home. However, each avian Ulysses who wore the lenses, but no magnets, faultlessly navigated 150 miles southwest to Ithaca, then flew ever tighter circles around the loft and fluttered in like a helicopter to a perfect blind landing. Carrying the work forward after Keaton's untimely death soon after his experiment, Charles Walcott and Robert Greene of the State's University of New York at Stony Brook, working with James L. Gould of Princeton, outfitted pigeons with miniatures electromagnetic coils that let the researchers vary the type and orientation of applied field at will. They discovered that if the south pole of the field was directed up, the birds could still find home. But with the north pole up, they flew directly away from it. That meant they were using magnetic north as reference points. At about the same time, two German scientists, Martin Lindauer and Hermann Martin, analyzed 500,000 bees' dances and found a magnetic error in them, a compensation for the difference between magnetic north and true north. They were also able to introduce specific angles of error in the dances with specifically oriented coils around the hive. Here was proof that magnetic guidance systems existed in both the birds and the bees. The next question was how the systems worked. In 1975, Richard P. Blakemore, then a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, astonished the world of biology with the announcement that some bacteria, the lowliest of all cells, also had a magnetic sense. Blakemore made the discovery when studying the salt marshes of Cape Cod. He noticed that one type of bacterium always oriented itself north-south on the microscopic slides. Soon he found magnetotactic bacteria, those reactive to magnetism, near Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he set about studying them with Richard Frankel of MIT's Magnet Lab. The direction to magnetic north points through the Earth somewhere down from the horizon, and the scientists become convinced that the bacteria were using the field to guide themselves ever downward. To the mud where they throve, since they were too small to sink through the random molecular motion of the water around them. Recent work by Cornell biologist Craig Adler showed that their magnetic sense of salamanders was many times more acute than that of pigeons. Not only could the amphibians find home without light or other common cues, in addition, when Adler tried to confuse them with artificial fields, they quickly adapted to their interference and oriented themselves correctly in relation to the weaker geomagnetic background. This idea was later confirmed by findings that microbes at Rio and in New Zealand were south seekers. Blakemore's electron micrographs soon revealed a surprising structure. Each bacterium contained within it, like a chain of cut jet stones, a straight line of magnetic microcrystals surrounded by a thin membrane. Each of these particles was a single domain, the smallest piece of the mineral that could still be a magnet. Blakemore's bacteria led Gould to look for similar crystals in bees and pigeons. Since an electron microscopy survey of even a bee's brain would take several lifetimes, he examined the insects with a squid magnetometer. After confirming that they were magnetic, he dissected them and narrowed the location down to a part of the abdomen. Using the same method, Walcott and Greene dissected the heads of pigeons, gradually subdividing them with non-magnetic probes and scalpels. After The painstaking search, the investigations found a tiny magnetic deposit in a 1 by 2 millimeter piece of tissue, richly festooned within the nerves on the right side of the head between the brain and the inner table of the skull. The same dot of the tissue contained yellow crystals of the iron storage protein ferritin, indicating that the pigeons, like the bacteria, synthesize their own iodestone crystals. Oh, lodestone crystals, sorry. As usual, these recent answers have raised plenty of new questions. The existence of magnetic sensors in such diverse creatures as bacteria, bees, and birds. The current count of species with magnetic organs is 27, including primates, suggests that a magnetic sense has existed from the very beginning of life, perhaps only to be perfected by creatures that need to get around a lot. Do all animals then have the same sensors? And do they always serve the same function? How is the information read out of the crystals by the nervous system and translated into directions? What aspect of the Earth's field do these organs sense? Keaton noticed an especially odd thing about his pigeon's flight patterns. When flying on visual flight rules by sun compasses, they once get their bearings, then move off straight forward toward Ithaca. But when using their magnetic compass, the birds would fly due west from their release point until they got over Lake Ontario due north of Ithaca. Then, out of sight of land, they would make a right angle, turn to the left, and follow the exact meridian of home. He told me this, but never published the observation because he didn't know what to make of it. He said, I asked physicists as they were making contact with a certain magnetic line of force. The man said, no, magnetic lines of force are just as arbitrary convention we use to symbolize a field and describe anomalies in it, such as occur around iron ore deposits. As far as we know, the lines have no equivalent in reality, and if they did, they would vary all over the place as the Earth's field changes anyway. Do pigeons then follow some map-like structures in the Earth's field itself? A grid like that described by dowsers and geomancers since ancient times, something we can't find today even with our squid. Some migrating birds make a dogleg to the east in their north-south flyaway, sailing out of sight of land over Lake Superior. Do they go out of their way to avoid being disoriented by iron ore deposits in the Masabi Range? We can suspect, but we don't know yet. To most people, of course, the most interesting questions concern themselves. Do we, too, have compasses in our heads? On June 29th, 1979, R. Robin Baker, a young University of Manchester researcher into bionavigation, led a group of high school students into a bus at Barnard Castle, near Leeds, England. Baker blindfolded and earmuffed them, then gave them all headbands. Half of the headgear contained magnets and half contained brass bars that their wearers thought were magnets. As the volunteers leaned back to concentrate, Baker wove a maze-like course through the town's tangled streets, then traveled a straight way to the southwest. After a few miles, the coach stopped while the students wrote on cards an estimate of the compass direction toward the school. Then the driver turned through 135 degrees and continued east to a spot southeast of the school, where the students again estimated their direction. When the cards were analyzed, it turned out that the persons with brass bars by their heads had been able to sense the proper heading quite reliably, while those wearing magnets had not. Gould and his Princeton co-worker, K.P. Abel, recently tried to replicate Baker's experiment, but failed. However, Baker's review of the attempt suggested that the volunteers' directional sense may have been thrown off by magnetic storms. Weak magnetic gradients inside the bus and/or the greater electromagnetic contamination of Princeton compared with rural England. Baker and co-worker Janice Mather have recently devised a simple test method. In the middle of specially built, light-tight wooden hut free of magnetic interference, the subject is blindfolded, ear-muffed, and seated on a friction-free swivel chair. After being turned around several times, the subject must estimate his or her compass heading as before. With statistically consistent success in more than 150 persons, Baker believes he has proven the existence of a human magnetic sense. Oddly enough, he finds that as long as people can't feel the sun or sense some other obvious cue, they can judge direction better with blindfolds on. Otherwise, they start rationalizing the process, trying to deduce the right way from too little evidence and becoming confused. He surmised that the magnetic sense serves its purpose best by unconsciously giving a continuous sense of direction without its owners having to be aware of it all the time, and thus freeing attention for the search for food, a mate, shelter, and so on. In 1983, using magnetic instruments in selective shielding experiments, Baker and his coworkers reported locating magnetic deposits close to the pineal and pituitary glands in the sinuses of the human's ethmoid bone, a spongy bone in the center of the head behind the nose and between the eyes. It's interesting to note that the selective shielding studies done in the Earth 1970s by Czech emerging biophysicist Szabolcs Harvalik, an advisor to the U.S. Army Advanced Material Concepts Agency, pointed to this same spot as one of two areas. The other was the adrenal glands, where the dowsing ability resided. In 1984, a group headed by zoologist Michael Walker of the University of Hawaii in Honolulu isolated single-domain magnetite crystals from a sinus of the same bone in the yellowfin tuna and China nook salmon. The crystals were of a shape normally shown only by magnetite synthesized by living things rather than geological processes. Abundant nerve findings entered the magnetic tissue, and the crystals were organized in chains much like those in magnetotactic bacteria. Each crystal was apparently fixed in place but free to rotate slightly in response to external magnetic forces. Calculations showed that such chains would be able to sense the Earth's magnetic field with an accuracy of few seconds of arc, or a few hundred feet of surface position. The result correlated perfectly with earlier homing studies on live tuna by the same group. This detailed work, along with related earlier research, strongly suggests that all vertebrates have a similar magnetic organ in the ethmoid sinus area. I suspect that this organ also transmits biocycle timing cues from the Earth's micropulsations to the pineal gland. The face of the deep. DNA pioneer Erwin Chargaff has called the origin of life a subject for the scientist who has everything, but that hasn't stopped many of us, or even him, for that matter, from speculating about it. There are numerous detailed pictures of that primal scene in print today, but most are variations on one theory: warm soup and lightning. Life on Earth began some 4 billion years ago, or roughly 1 or 2 billion years after the world itself was born. The atmosphere then was completely different, much like Jupiter's today, mostly ammonia and methane. Into that atmosphere, some source of energy, lightning, heat, and ultraviolet radiation have all been suggested. led to the spontaneous formation of simple organic compounds. Sifting into the oceans for millions of centuries, these compounds would have coalesced by chance into ever more elaborate patterns. According to the theory, this process culminated in close protocells, able to resist the reactivity of other structures while growing through incorporation of similar compounds. This idea owes its dominance largely to an important experiment made by S.L. Miller in 1953. Miller pumped a facsimile of the presumed early atmosphere, ammonia, methane, and water vapor, continuously past an electric spark. After several days, he had some amino acids. Since these are bricks of DNA, RNA, and all proteins, the evidence seemed very good. Later runs yielded even more sophisticated molecules. In water, they coalesced into globules with a sort of membrane around them called coacervates by A.I. Upperin and protenoids by Sidney Fox, two of the most assiduous students of biogenesis. Nothing came close to being alive in any of these spark chambers, however. More important, the experiments raised two difficulties, one theoretical, one practical. The soup theory needed to come up with a very sophisticated entity, a living cell with some genetic system using DNA or RNA, right off the bat. According to our notions of biology, nothing could be alive before that point. Yet it seemed incredible that chance associations of the building blocks could form a palace of such complexity without passing through a mud hut stage. When the warm soup theory was first advanced, the mechanistic persuasion was at its height. Living things were complicated machines, the molecular machinery they were. However, the concept of a cell was much simpler than it is today. No longer is it considered a mere baglet of jelly with a few master molecules telling it what to do. Even the membrane of the simplest bacterium responds in intricate ways to information from outside. Yet, our best electron microscopes haven't yet revealed a complexity of structure adequate to explain its work. There was a basic chemical problem as well. All organic compounds exist in two forms, or isomers. Each contains the same number of atoms, but in one they're arranged as mirror image of the other. One is right-handed and the other is left-handed. They're identified by the way they bend light in solution. The dextro-rotatory D forms rotate it to the right, while levotorotary L isomers refract it to the left. All artificial methods of synthesizing organic compounds, including the spark experiments, yield a roughly equal measure of D and L molecules. However, all living things consist of either D or L forms, depending on the species, but never both. We must conceive of the first living things as something unexpected, not just simpler versions of what we see around us. They couldn't have been cells. They couldn't have had a DNA, RNA, protein system, a living membrane, or a nerve impulse network. We can try to define the bare minimum, the processes that must be available before an entity can be called living. There must be a way to receive information about external conditions, process it, and store it so that the data change that being's response to the same stimulus in the future. In other words, a sort of crude consciousness and memory must be present from the first. A life form must be able to sense damage and repair itself. Third, we can expect that it would show some sort of cyclic activity, perhaps tuned primarily to the circadian rhythm of the lunar day. Self-replication, one of the main requirements in the DNA-based theory, can be dispensed with. An organism that can fully heal its injuries is theoretically immortal. The criteria for life can be summarized as organization, information processing, regeneration, and rhythm. The funny thing is that all of these criteria are met by the activities of semiconducting crystals. Semiconductivity occurs naturally in several inorganic crystals, including silicon, one of the most common elements, and the rare earth germanium. Moreover, extremely small amounts of contaminants will change the crystal's electrical properties dramatically in doping. The Earth's volcanic mixing would have produced minerals with a wide variety of current handling abilities to start from. Most important, the piezoelectric, pyroelectric, photoelectric, and other response of the semiconducting crystals could have served as an analog method of processing and storing information about pressure, heat, and light. Moreover, repeated passage of current through some semiconductors permanently changes the materials of characteristics so as to make the same electrical responses easier in the future. Movement of electrons along the crystal lattices inevitably would have been shaped by geocelestial cycles in the Earth's electromagnetic field, as well as by fields around other such crystalline organisms nearby, providing a sense of time and information about the neighbors. The currents also would have instantly reflected any loss of material and guided the deposition of replacement atoms to restore the original structure. The idea of certain rocks in the course of a billion years or so gradually become responsive to their surroundings, growing, learning to hurt when a lava flow or sulfuric rain are ate away parts of a vertex. Slowly rebuilding, pulsing with, well, life, even developing a liquid crystal stage and climbing free of their stony nests like Cadmus dragon's teeth on the lizards in the M.C. Escher's print. All this may be seen a bit bizarre, yet it's really no more strange than imagining the same transformation from droplets of broth. The change happened somehow. The biggest hurdle for this theory is accepting the idea that life could develop in the dry state, either out of the oceans or in the rocks underneath them. Since the mid-1960s, it has seemed more plausible for it was than that H.E. Hinton of the University of Bristol, England, learned that at least one organism spends part of its life completely without liquid water. Certain flies of the Sahara Desert lay their eggs in the brief pools formed by the rare rains. The larvae go through several metamorphoses in the water, but they're almost always interrupted by evaporation of the pool. They're completely desiccated in the state of Hinton named cryptobiosis. They survived months or years until the next rainstorm, whereupon they take up where they left off. The larva can be quick dried and stored in a vacuum bottle for many years. Placed in water, they resurrect in a few minutes. If a larva is cut into where active, it takes 6 minutes to die. It is flash dried in the first minute. 2 pieces can be kept on the shelf for years, but when returned to water, they'll live out the remaining 5 minutes. Contrary to common sense, it appears that in this case, life doesn't need water, but death can't occur without it. Getting rid of the water equals life assumption makes the crystalline theory more believable. Conditions on the young planet favored forest of crystals. It was hot. Volcanoes were constantly firing new materials into dense, dark shells of turbulent gases. However, the crystals would still have needed outside energy to overcome the entropy of non-living matter, with an organizing principle built into them from the start. It's not too hard to imagine them acquiring other kinds of molecules, including the organics raining from the sky and dissolving in the waters. Then life would have been on its way to developing the biochemistry we now know, the genetic system, and the consequent appearance of sexuality, which is the basis of all energy source for the transition. Sorry, which is the basis of all the creatures now alive or known from the fossil record. Still, we need an energy source for the transition. Lightning won't work in this context. We also need an explanation for the exclusively left or right-handed molecules. In 1974, F.E. Cole and E.R. Graff of New Orleans made a theoretical analysis of Precambrian Earth's electromagnetic field that fulfilled both needs. They reasoned that since the atmosphere was much larger then, it must have pushed the ionosphere much further out than it is today into the region of the Van Allen belts. The Earth would then have had an electromagnetic resonator of two concentric spheres, the upper atmosphere and the surface. Today, as in the past, the Earth's pulsing magnetic field combines with the solar wind to induce large currents in the Van Allen belts. In the Precambrian era, however, the fluctuations of current in the Van Allen belts in turn would have generated huge currents in the nearby ionosphere. Since the Earth's metallic core is an excellent conductor, the ionospheric currents would have coupled to it, producing an enormous and constant electrical discharge through the atmosphere and into the Earth. Moreover, since the distance around the core at that time was roughly equal to one wavelength of electromagnetic energy at 10 cycles per second, or about 18,000 miles, this discharge would have pulsed at 10 hertz throughout the resonant cavity, which encompassed the whole atmosphere and surface. Besides directly providing electrical energy, this discharge would have produced abundant heat, ultraviolet radiation, and infrasound, or pressure waves, all of which would have fostered varied chemical activity. Such a dense and electrically supercharged atmosphere undoubtedly would have produced great quantities of amino acids and peptides. They came together in the air and water, linking chainwise to form proteins and nucleic acids. The vectors of electromagnetic force would have favored spiraled shapes, twisting in one direction or the other, depending on whether the reaction occurred in the northern or the southern hemisphere. In 1981, W. Thierman and U. Jarzak found some direct evidence for this theory by synthesizing organic compounds in a steady state magnetic field. Changing the orientation of the field gave them higher yields of either D or L forms. It may be possible to run a further check on the Cole and Graff hypothesis at one place in the solar system. The great red spot of Jupiter, this permanent hurricane, whose eye could swallow the Earth, continually emits prodigious electrical discharges through an atmosphere much like the one proposed for Precambrian times. It may be synthesizing organic compounds and energizing a transition to life even now. On Earth, all entities formed within the 10 Hz discharge and all of their descendants would resonate at the same frequency or show extreme sensitivity to it, even after the original power source had been disconnected. The 10 Hz band would remain supremely important for most life forms, as indeed it was. As already noted, it's the primary frequency of the EEG in all animals, and it can be used to restore normal circadian rhythms to humans cut off from the normal fields of Earth, Moon, and Sun. William Ross Addy of Loma Linda VA Hospital in California has found the magnetic fields modulate at about the same frequency can be used to change behavior of monkeys in several important ways, which are described more fully in the next chapter. The colon graph theory also suggests how the spark of life turned itself off. The currents driving the discharges would have ceased as atmosphere gradually became depleted by escape of the lighter gases and by incorporation of the ammonia and methane into organic compounds. As this happened, the ionosphere would have gradually descended, becoming disconnected from the Van Allen belts. The ionospheric currents would have become too small to couple to the Earth's core, and the atmospheric cavity too small to resonate at the core's prescribed frequency. At that point, the plug was pulled, but life was well on its way. Aside from competition from more advanced creatures, the loss of the energy source would explain why we see today no remnants of the transitional forms still emerging from inanimate matter. This solid state theory of life's creation is more than an exciting picture of our birth in a shower of sparks. It leads us to another of biology's great mysteries, the evolution of nervous systems, by a sensible sequence of steps. First, there would have been a crystalline protocell transmitting information directly through its molecular lattice. As the first cells developed, we can envision chains of microcrystals, then chains of organic polymers transmitting information in the form of semiconducting currents. Although the exact mechanisms of electron passage through living tissue is far from clear, nearly all organic matter exhibits piezoelectricity and all other hallmarks of semiconduction. Furthermore, in a series of experiments during the 1970s, Freeman Cope, a Navy biophysicist building of Szent-Györgyi work, has found evidence of superconduction at room temperatures in a variety of living matter. Currents briefly induced in superconductors have been known to flow for many years without decay, but the phenomenon was hitherto been attained only near absolute zero. Although Cope's work is still preliminary and uncorroborated, he has found electromagnetic data consistent with superconduction in E. coli bacteria, frog and crayfish nerves, yeast sea urchin eggs, and molecules of RNA, melanin pigment, and the enzyme lysozyme. Whatever the exact details of the conducting system, the first multicellular organisms probably had networks of cells that were much like the first single cells. Later, these network cells would have specialized for their DC carrying duties, linking into syncytia to avoid the high resistance in intercellular junctions. Somewhere along the line of central processing center and information storehouse would have been developed. At the same time, separate input and output tracks would have appeared, and the DC system would have neared its peak of specialization as its cells evolved into prototypes of glial, ependymal, and Schwann cells. At about this point, the high-speed digital impulse system for handling more complex information would have begun to form inside the older one. Today, all multicellular animals have this kind of hybrid system, whose complexities should provide work at least a few more generations of neurophysiologists. Crossroads of Evolution. The Coronal graph theory has one crucial requirement. The polarity of the Earth's magnetic field must have stayed the same during the resonant period. Otherwise, there would be a mixture of right and left isomers in living tissues. As far as we can tell, the field did remain steady in Precambrian times, but we have ample proof that its poles have reversed many times during the last half-billion years. Each time, the shift has coincided with the extinction of many species. The geomagnetic record is written into two places: in ingenious rocks bearing magnetic minerals, and in ocean floor sediments. Magnetic particles in molten rock are free to move and align themselves with the prevailing magnetic field. As the rock cools, they're frozen in place. In the same way, magnetic particles settling onto the ocean floor reflect the orientation of the field at the time of the deposit. Ocean sediments and rock, they eventually have given us an undisturbed magnetic chronology for many millions of years, while they relatively few strata of igneous rock undisturbed by later upheavals give us occasional glimpses further back. The reversals happen very fast as geologic time goes. The field strength falls to about half its average for a few thousand years. Then during another 1,000 years, the poles change places. And then the field regains its normal strength in another few thousand years. All told, the change takes about 5,000 years. In the early 1960s, when the reversals were first discovered, geophysicists believed the magnetic field disappeared completely during the pole reversal. Thus, they thought that the absence of electromagnetic umbrella that protected life from high-energy ultraviolet and cosmic rays would account for large-scale extinctions. These great dyings had long puzzled paleontologists. Soon, the demise of the species of Radiolarian was correlated with the magnetic field reversal. Radiolarians are microscopic plankton animals with hard calcareous skeletons. Each species has a distinct, intricate shape, so their remains form an easily recognizable continuous record in sediment cores. By 1967, James D. Hayes, Neil D. Opdyke of Columbia's Lament Doherty Geological Observatory had correlated the disappearance of 8 types of radiolarians with the reversals. Each species had been widespread and abundant. Each extinction took place abruptly with no previous decline in population. The radiation barrage theory seemed confirmed. However, it has since been learned that the field strength drops only by half, not enough to drastically reduce the protective power of the Van Allen belts and ionosphere. Moreover, radiolarian populations extend down into several yards of water, which should protect them from the radiation anyway. Hayes has since drawn less specific outlines of current knowledge thus. As animals grow more specialized in the course of evolution, they become more sensitive to some as yet unknown lethal effect of the reversals. Long periods without reversals, the quiescent era sometimes lasts tens of millions of years, seem to produce a profusion of species specifically susceptible to the effect, and they're weeded out at the next shift. We know of two specifically widespread extinctions. One at the end of the Permian period, about 225 million years ago, wiped out half of the kind of animals then alive, from protozoa to early reptiles. The same kind of curtain dropped on the age of dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period, some 70 million years ago. In both cases, frequent magnetic pole reversals had resumed after long quiescence. Many periods of less extensive extinction have also been documented in the fossil record and correlated with the field reversals. Most recently, J. John Sepkowski Jr. and David M. Ropp of the University of Chicago reported that they believe to be a 26 million year cycle in the major dyings. If their hypothesis holds up, there may be some solar or galactic influence that interacts with magnetic reversal for maximum destructive effect. We can only surmise that the Earth's field was instrumental in life's beginnings, but that by 1971 we knew virtually for certain that its polarity shifts had shaped life's development by a pruning of species. That year, I was invited to a private meeting at Lamont to talk about the reversals, the sole MD among a score of biologists and geophysicists. At that time, we could only speculate as to how the extinction effect came about. We didn't even have a workable theory of what changes inside the Earth caused the turnabouts, or how the process affected the micropulsations and other aspects of the field. All we could agree on was that there were probably changes in every aspect of it, and our knowledge hasn't progressed much since then. The pole shift happens so slowly that living things may well adapt to it easily. The 50% decline in field strength also seems rather unimportant. However, since we know the micropulsations control biocycles, including the timing of the mitotic rhythm, a major change in their frequency could be catastrophic. Experiments with artificial extremely low frequency fields, see Chapter 15, have shown that vibrational rates near normal but slightly above from about 30 to 100 Hertz cause dramatic changes in the cell cycle time. This interferes with normal growth of the embryo and may tend to foster abnormal malignant growth as well. If a geomagnetic reversal raises the micropulsation frequencies into this range, the accumulation of growth errors over many generations could well mean extinction. We have no way of making a forecast, however. Reversals seem to happen at widely varied intervals, as often as every 50,000 years during some periods, many millions of years apart during other times. The last one seems to have occurred about 730,000 years ago. Several scientists have interpreted data from NASA's MagSat orbiter and from measurements of the magnetic particles in lake sediments as indicating that the Earth's magnetic field strength is steadily declining, and that has been for the last few thousand years. If so, we may already be entering the next reversal, but it's also possible we're merely experiencing one of the field's many short-term variations. Nor can we be sure how serious a reversal would be for us. Hominids have weathered them in the past, but we have an extra reason for being uneasy this time. If we're entering a reversal now, it will be the first one in which the normal field is contaminated with our own electromagnetic effluvia. And the most powerful of these at 50 and 60 Hertz fall right in the middle of the danger band in which interference with growth controls can be expected. The field giveth as well as taketh away, however. If we can hang on until the next peak of its strength, we may benefit from subtle infusion of electromagnetic wisdom. As ingenious theory recently proposed by Francis Ivanhoe, a pharmacologist and anthropologist at 2 universities in San Francisco, suggests how important it may have been to our own development. Ivanhoe made a statistical survey of the brain case volume of all known Paleolithic human skulls and correlated the increase with the magnetic field strength and major advances in human culture during the same period. Ivanhoe found bursts of brain-sized evolution at about 380,000 to 340,000 years ago, and again at 55,000 to 30,000 years ago. Both periods corresponded to major ice ages, the Mendel and Worm, respectively, and they were also eras when great culture advances were made. The widespread domestication of fire by Homo erectus in the early Mendel and appearance of Homo sapiens sapiens, Cro-Magnon peoples, and gradual decline of Neanderthals, Homo sapiens during the Worm. 2 other glaciations in the same time span. The Gans of about 1.2 million to 1.50 thousand years ago, and the rise of about 150,000 to 100,000 years ago didn't call forth such obvious advancements in human evolution. They also differed from the other 2 in that average geomagnetic field intensity was much lower. Ivanhoe has proposed a direct link from magnetic field through the growth hormones regulator pathways in the brain to account for sharp evolutionary gains. He suggests that part of the hippocampus, a section of the brain's temporal lobe, acts as a transducer of electromagnetic energy. A part of the hippocampus called a Mons horn, an arch with one-way nerve traffic directed by a strong current flow, may read our variations in field strength, feeding them by a bundle of well-documented pathways called the fornix to the hypothalamus and thence to the anterior pituitary. Where growth hormone is produced. It's known that larger amounts of this hormone in pregnancy increase the size of the cerebral cortex and the number of its nerve cells in the offspring, as compared with other parts of the brain. Ivanhoe also notes that the hippocampus and its connections with the hypothalamus are among the parts of the brain that are much larger in humans than other primates. The idea gains further support from the fact that neural activity in the hippocampus increases with electrical stimulation and reaches a maximum of 10 to 15 cycles per second, at or slightly above the dominant micropulsation frequency of today's field. The most powerful shaper of our development may turn out to be the subtlest, a force that completely invisible to us, hearing without ears. We've considered how the electromagnetic fields of Earth, Moon, and Sun affect life. In the next chapter, we'll ponder the effects of artificial fields from our machines. There's probably another interaction, however, of which we know much less: the effects produced on living things by biomagnetic fields of other creatures. If one nervous system could sense the field of another, it would go a long way toward explaining extrasensory perception. Following the curious dogma that what we don't understand can't exist, mainstream science has dismissed psychic phenomena as delusions or hoaxes simply because they're rarer than sleep, dreams, memory, growth, pain, or consciousness, which are all inexplicable in traditional terms, but are too common to be denied. 50 years ago, when J.B. Ryan of Duke University first published results of his card-guessing experiments, scientists eagerly debated and tested the subject for a few years. Then, although at least 60% of the attempts to confirm Ryan's work also got better than chance results in a replication rate better than that in the most areas of psychology. The openness somehow disappeared. Ever since World War II, serious parapsychologists have been hounded out the forum of science. In the 1950s, for example, Science and Nature both published attacks on certain results of Ryan and S.G. Soule, an early psi researcher at London University. Today, this attitude may be waning. G.R. Price, the author of one of the diatribes, apologized in Science in 1972, and both journals have begun accepting occasional reports on psychic research, although still confining themselves mainly to negative findings. As the climate has begun to change, a few researchers have looked for electromagnetic fields as possible basis for extrasensory perception. The results so far have been as inconclusive as those from any other approach. In 1978, E. Balanovsky and J.G. Taylor used a variety of antennae and skin electrodes and magnetometers to monitor a number of people claiming paranormal powers. They found no electric or magnetic fields associated with success in telepathy experiments. In 1982, Robert G. John, Dean of Engineering at Princeton, assembled the most impressive battery of electronic equipment ever brought to bear on the subject. He found definite effects by mental forces on interferometer displays and strain gauge readings, along with positive results in remote viewing experiments. The tests can be reliably repeated, however, and seem to vary with the moods of researcher and subject, perhaps with other immeasurable environmental factors. The same dependence on attitude. Experiments seem to work more often for believers than doubters, has bedeviled psychic research from its beginning. Although John came up with no clear-cut findings on electromagnetic factors, he was forced to sublimely understated conclusions that once the illegitimate research and invalid criticism have been set aside, the remaining accumulated evidence of psychic phenomena comprises an array of experimental observations which compound to a philosophical dilemma. We must remember that our study of biofields is still in its infancy. It's only a decade since the squid first enabled us to find the magnetic field around our heads at all. Pigeons have a magnetic detector thousands of times more sensitive than the latest instruments. We also know that the interaction of semiconducting currents with external magnetic fields is thousands of times greater than that of currents in a wire. And engineers have built microscopic devices that enhance this sensitivity by a factor of another 1,000 or more. The electron microscope has shown us crystal-like structures of previously unsuspected complexity in all living cells, whose functions we can only guess at. There's now some evidence that psychic intent can influence the flow of current in solid-state devices, so we may be nearing the energy fields at which extrasensory factors work. Since all living things generate weak electromagnetic fields, and since many of, if not at all, can sense those of the Earth, communication by this medium remains a strong possibility. Recent disclosures of a multi-million-dollar research effort in this area by the hard-headed weapons planners at the Department of Defense is one more reason why those scientists who work in the public shouldn't dismiss the idea. We must always be careful to place more weight on observation than current theory. We must remember that we don't yet fully understand magnetism. It now appears that the single domain with both magnetic poles may not be the smallest unit of magnetism after all. Physicists now posit the existence of magnetic monopoles, particles having the characteristics of just one pole, north or south. In fact, there's some experimental evidence for them. Some theoreticians go even further, envisioning a hitherto suspected kind of magnetism, a composite of waves and monopole particles like light. Living things may interact with such a now immeasurable energy. Any such message system would have at least two major difficulties to overcome in the course of evolution. Our own electrical engineering experience, however, suggests workable approaches life may have taken. One problem is that the strength of biofields is far below that of the Earth's field. Hence, any input from other creatures would be embedded in the noise. This is a common obstacle to telecommunications, as there are several ways around it. The easiest is for sender and receiver both to be frequency locked, that is, tuned to one frequency and insensitive to others. Such a lock-in system might explain why spontaneous ESP experiences most often happen between relatives or close friends. The sensitivity of our instruments may someday develop to the point where we can tune into biomagnetic fields on select frequencies, thus experimenting directly with ESP as we now do radio. Another theoretical difficulty is the fact that psychic transmission doesn't seem to fade with distance. The electromagnetic field around an animal's nervous system, on the other hand, starts out unimaginably small and then diminishes rapidly. However, extremely low frequency ELF transmissions have a peculiar property. Because of their interaction with the ionosphere, even weak signals in this frequency range from 0.1 to 100 cycles per second travel all the way around the world without dying out. And an innate frequency selector is operating within this band. If an innate frequency selector is operating within this band, reception should be the same anywhere on Earth. At this time, the DC perineural system and its electromagnetic fields provide the only theory of parapsychology that's amenable to direct experiment, and it yields hypothesis for almost all such phenomena except precognition. Telepathy may be transmission and reception via biologically programmed channel of ELF vibrations in the perineural system's electromagnetic field. Dowsing may involve an unconscious sense of the electromagnetic fields of underground water or minerals, an idea given some support by Russian experiments in 1960s. Nikolai N. Sakhanov, now with the USSR's Ministry of Geological, found that the accuracy of 40 professional dowsers diminished by at least 3/4 when he wound wound a current carrying wire around their wrists or brought a horseshoe magnet near their heads. Biological semiconductors even offer a possible basis for the aurora, often reported around living things and sensitivities. There has been speculation as that this is halo might be some manifestation of an electromagnetic biofield. The ability of high voltage Kirlian photography to produce an image very much like descriptions of the aurora has aroused hope that the technique might render some aspect of psychic phenomena visible in a way that would be conducive to experiment. Because of this possibility, our lab investigated Kirlian photography during the mid-1970s. We obtained beautiful pictures that seemed to vary in response to changes in the health of the test organism. However, the method failed one crucial test. If the Kirlian halo actually reflected the biofield or some other basic aspect of life, it should have disappeared when the organism being photographed died. Alas, it did not. The image remained the same as long as the water content of the corpse remained constant. We found the images were entirely due to a simple physical event, a coronal discharge. This occurred when a high voltage of electric field broke down the air molecules between the two condenser plates of the Kirlian apparatus. The amount of water vapor in the air changed the voltage at which this happened. And on-color film produced coronas in a different colors and sizes. We found no evidence that the Kirlian image was related to the living state, nor did we find that it could serve as a screen on which might be reflected some invisible field or aura, another possibility that had been suggested. This is not to say that the aura occasionally perceived by some people around other organisms is imaginary. Things that appear so often in folklore often turn out to have a basis in fact. However, the body's magnetic field is far too weak to account for it. Our biofields, even if they were many times stronger, couldn't possibly emit light. But an appropriate sensitive magnetic detector in the brain, if it had nerve connections to the visual cortex, might see the magnetic field in a manner of speaking. In a similar way, astronauts in space see Cherenkov radiation, flashes of light that have been traced to the passage of high-energy cosmic rays through the retina. On the other hand, the aurora could literally be a form of light, perhaps at frequencies invisible to all but a few of us. The discovery of light-emitting diodes is still fairly recent. As you will recall, we found that bone happens to have such properties. The point of that experiment was its evidence that bone contains semiconducting p-n junction diodes. There may be other diodes living in living things. The relationship between the nerve endings and the skin is an interesting one in this context. The skin-nerve interface, the closest and normal equivalent to the neuroepidermal junction that triggers regeneration, may well be a diode. If so, the proper level of current could cause emission of light from a skin. It's even possible that such an array of diodes with very large currents might produce a holographic image of the body of organic screen. Such a reputed image of Christ of the Shroud of Turin. If extrasensory communication really is a function of the DC system, why isn't it more common and widely accepted? We may never know how well distributed it is among animals, although the number of pets who have returned to their owners over long distances suggests that many dogs and cats can find specific people by an unknown sense. The Duke University Parapsychology Laboratory has authenticated more than 50 such cases, many involving travel of hundreds or thousands of miles. We can't expect that some species would be better at it than others, just as pigeons navigate by Earth's magnetic field far better than most other creatures. Among humans, some may simply be more gifted than others through genetic chance or some facet of their upbringings. Then again, the psychic sense may be a universal ability that was forgotten or suppressed as we came to depend more and more on language to get our message across. If they do depend on the same system, psychic ability and regeneration may go together. They may generally be better among simple animals. As the digital impulse system grew more efficient, its information may have overwhelmed the senses operating through the earlier mode. In fact, this may be part of the digital system's purpose. The ever-present hum of electromagnetic information from other creatures may have become an intolerable burden. Think how confused you would feel if you could simultaneously hear what everyone else in the world was thinking. After all, mediums, sorcerers, and psi experimenters all agree that some sort of trance or mental quietude, a reduction of nerve impulse activity, is needed for best results. According to Elmer Green, yogis of some Tibetan traditions teach clairvoyance to novices by having them meditate seated on a glass plate, facing north toward a sheet of polished copper in a dark, windowless room with a bar magnet suspended over their heads, its north pole pointing up to the zenith. The biofield lends itself to theories of psychokinesis and object imprinting. All matter, living and non-living, is ultimately an electromagnetic phenomenon. The material world, at least as far as physics has penetrated, is an atomic structure held together by electromagnetic forces. If some people can detect fields from other organisms, why shouldn't some people be able to affect other beings by means of their linked fields? Since the cellular functions of our bodies are controlled by our DC fields, there's reason to believe that gifted healers generate supportive electromagnetic effects that they convey their patients or manipulate to change their sufferers' internal currents directly without limiting themselves to the placebo effect of trust and hope. Once we admit the idea of this kind of influence, the same kind of willed action of biofields on the electromagnetic structure of inanimate matter becomes a possibility. This encompasses all forms of psychokinesis, from metal bending experiments in which trickery has been excluded to more rigidly controlled tests with interferometers, hypotheses that offer much hope of testability. On a less spectacular level, we must ask whether the biofield can project the individual nature of a person's thoughts onto his or her surroundings, changing the electromagnetic characteristics of these objects so that a person can be sensed by others even through absent. This may well be the commonest of all paranormal experiences, and the number of crimes solved by psychics reacting to the mere scene of the crime should entitle scientists to investigate the idea without fear of ridicule from the colleagues. Over and over again, biology has found that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. We should expect that the same as true as bioelectromagnetic fields. All life on Earth can be considered a unit, a glaze of sentience spread thinly over the crust. In toto, its fields would be a hollow, invisible sphere inscribed with a tracery of all the thoughts and emotions of all creatures. The Jesuit priest and the paleontologist philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin postulated the same thing, a new sphere, or ocean of mind, rising from the biosphere like a spume, given a biological communications channel that can circle the whole Earth in an instant, possibly based on life's very mode of origin. It would be a wonder if each creature had not retained a link of with some such aggregate mind. If so, the perineural DC system, could lead us to the great reservoir of image and dream, variously called the collective unconscious, intuition, the pool of archetypes, higher intelligence, deific or satanic, the muse herself.